The last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before we proceed, I just thought, number one, great amendment, Congressman Lee. And, I was just reading, in the 1840s, there was a potato crop disappeared, and the blight just killed the potato crops in Ireland. And the Irish people were left starving, literally starving. And of the 8 million people in Ireland, 3 to 4 million faced starvation. About 1 million of them died of disease. 2 million of them, 2 million of the 8 million, came to the United States of America. According to a recent article back in those days in the Irish Times, it said, panic had set in by the winter of 1846. People risked winter voyages across the Atlantic on unsanitary, unsafe coffin ships. The nearly 100,000 who left for Canada in 1847, at least 30,000 were dead by the end of that year, perishing at sea and shortly thereafter. The article continues. People were placed in quarantine stations or held on board ships docked at ports. Refugees experienced violent and racist reactions in Liverpool, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Montreal, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And they all sought to restrict them. Yeah, they all sought to restrict the Irish. Isn't that interesting? They were fleeing hunger, and they sought to restrict them when they came, and they died on the voyage across, tens of thousands of them. And I just thought that in the context of what we're talking about here today, I bet that if they were leaders of the Judiciary Committee back then, they wouldn't have thought they were sending their best. They would have said, well, they're poor, they're hungry, they're uneducated, and they're fleeing for their lives. Those are economic refugees. We can't let them into the United States of America. And if we had had the same kind of Judiciary Committee back then, and had they been successful, they were not, in stopping them, 10% of everyone who lives in the United States of America can trace their roots to those Irish people. 10%, 1 out of 10 Americans can trace their roots to those people who came here. Now, I just bring this because I just think that at this extraordinary moment, when we see people fleeing and we say, well, they're not sending their best, and maybe we should be careful because they're different than we are. That's what they thought of the Irish, that they were different than the rest of us because they were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And it's true. They said, so why did they want to keep the Irish out? They wanted to keep them out because they were Irish. And I wish everybody could go back to see the cartoons and the editorials against them, the demeaning racist editorials against them. So there were two things they feared. They said, well, they're not sending their best. And number two, they said, they're Catholics. Their religion is not consonant with the United States of America. They're not Protestant. Yes, they're Catholics. Now, interestingly enough, about 120 years later, Kennedy, President Kennedy, his grandfather came in 1948. In the middle of this famine. 1848, thank you. 1848, in the middle of this famine. And just think about it. Sometimes I think about it and I think, wow, 120 years later, there was John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, the same Irish lineage that 120 years later in America, everybody said, stop them from coming in. They can't be led into the country. They're dangerous. They're poor. They're uneducated. And think about all of the contributions and think about the 10% of Americans who can trace. And I just want you to think today, think of Supreme Court justices, right? Heads of CEOs of companies, right? Presidents of the United States. Think of all of the Irish surname people in America and all of their contributions. And if people had stopped them from coming, think what a tragedy it would have been. And they wanted to stop them from coming because they weren't their best. And number two, because of their religion. It sounds so familiar today. Let's stop and have a Muslim ban because of their religion and because of where they come from. Because somehow that's not consonant with America. They were wrong then about the Irish. Guess what? Let's not make the same mistake again and be wrong once again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sure, I will.
articles that I'd like to put into the record. Office